Can you believe, just over 1,000 years ago, the very landscape of England, that green, rolling heartland we think of as eternal, was drowning in a darkness so profound, so absolute, that men genuinely believed the sun had been stolen from the sky. It wasn't just a harsh winter, it was the chilling, calculated end of a civilization, delivered on the blade of a foreign axe. This wasn't some slow, creeping societal decay. This was a catastrophic earthquake no one saw coming, crashing ashore with the sound of snapping oars and the terrifying shriek of men who worshipped chaos itself. Imagine living in a world where the only light came from the fires consuming your home, and the only prayer you knew seemed to go unanswered, swallowed by the endless, icy North Sea. Welcome to the year 800 CE. Forget everything you thought you knew about medieval history. We are not talking about polite raids or minor border skirmishes. We are diving headfirst into the psychological warfare, the total domination, the long, bloody winter nights of Norse rule that reshaped the destiny of the British Isles forever. They called them the Northmen, the Danes, the heathens, but the truth is they were something far worse. They were an unstoppable natural disaster, wrapped in armor, driven by a primal hunger for wealth and conquest. And their arrival didn't just challenge the Anglo-Saxon kings, it annihilated them, turning centuries of established order into smoldering ruins. Picture this scene. The wind howls across the frozen fields of Northumbria, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dried blood. It is midwinter, the time when historically wars paused, when armies retreated into their fortifications to wait out the inevitable frost. But for the Vikings, winter was just another weapon in their terrifying arsenal. It was during these darkest months, when the sun barely kissed the horizon, that the terror truly set in. The Anglo-Saxons were fighters, sure, but their strategy was built on seasonable warfare. The Vikings, however, operated on a different calendar, a brutal, pagan rhythm that demanded action regardless of the climate. They didn't retreat. They used the frozen rivers as highways to the unsuspecting heart of the kingdoms. Can you imagine the dread? You wake up, shivering, praying for the dawn, only to realize the silence isn't the quiet of a resting army, but the silence of a hunting pack that has surrounded your village under the cover of a freezing fog. The sight of those longships, those terrifying dragon-headed beasts, appearing through the mist where only flat fields should have been, must have instantly shattered the sanity of the watchmen. The hammer fell first on the holy places. Lindisfarne was just the appetizer. By 800 CE, the Vikings weren't just snatching gold and jewels. They were dismantling the very spiritual spine of England. They understood that to truly conquer a people, you must first extinguish their hope. And their hope resided in their monasteries, their centers of learning and faith. The chronicles, written in frantic, shaky hands by the few monks who survived the initial onslaught, described them not as men, but as vengeful spirits, creatures of ice and fire, who knew no fear and showed no mercy. They were the embodiment of Ragnarok come early, an apocalyptic force predicted in forgotten myths, now suddenly made real. The sheer psychological trauma of seeing these massive bearded men who dressed in furs and leather and fought with berserker fury, systematically burning books, shattering relics, and desecrating altars, cannot be overstated. It was a calculated affront to God himself, designed to show the Anglo-Saxons that their Christian protector was powerless against the raw, terrifying power of Odin and Thor. And here is the crucial detail we often miss. The rule wasn't just about fighting. It was about living under a cloud of constant, paralyzing fear. When the Vikings decided to settle, when they put down roots in places like Mercia and Northumbria, the rules of reality changed overnight. You were no longer ruled by your king, but by a jarl, a foreign chieftain whose sense of justice was measured only by the sharpness of his blade and the amount of silver you could produce. Your laws, your customs, your language, they became secondary, whispered traditions, practiced in secret corners, hidden from the watchful eyes of the invaders. The winter nights, already long and dark, became endless stretches of terror. Every creak of the door, every distant dog bark, every shadow shifting in the firelight, signaled the potential arrival of a patrol, demanding food, demanding women, demanding tribute, or simply demanding your life for the sport of it. Can you believe the sheer audacity? The English were forced to feed the armies that had slaughtered their families. They were forced to maintain the farms and markets that now supplied the very men who mocked their faith. This was servitude on a scale previously imaginable, a slow, freezing chokehold on the soul of a nation. We have to remember that in this era, the Anglo-Saxons were not unified. Mercia hated Wessex. Wessex distrusted Northumbria. The Vikings were masters of division, exploiting these ancient rivalries with ruthless efficiency, promising temporary peace to one group while systematically destroying the other. They made the English participate in their own demise. It was a winter that lasted decades, a night that seemed to have no dawn. The air itself felt heavy with the promise of violence, and survival was measured not by bravery, but by how successfully you could disappear into the desolate landscape. This is the stage upon which the epic struggle for England was fought. A struggle against the cold, against the pagan gods, and against the seemingly endless stream of dragon ships pouring onto their shores. We are going deep now into the heart of the darkness to understand how a small group of northern warriors managed to flip the world upside down and establish an empire built on frost, fury, and the sheer, terrifying spectacle of their long-awaited arrival. Grab your warmest cloak, secure your weapons, and prepare yourself, because the winter of the axe has just begun. The winter of the axe had begun, and the world, the small, contained world of Anglo-Saxon England, was instantly and irrevocably shattered. The initial shockwave of the Norse arrival did more than just break defenses. It broke the very concept of time and season, proving that the ancient laws of comfort and safety were dead. The coastal watchers, shivering under their meager woolen cloaks, had expected a lull, a blessed period of white silence when the sea itself became a frozen, impassable sentinel. Instead, the Vikings turned the deep winter months into their private hunting ground, leveraging the very misery of the cold against a people unprepared for sustained, multi-seasonal aggression. Their Drakkar, those terrifyingly swift, shallow-drafted longships, didn't fight the harsh tides. They rode them, navigating estuary mouths and cutting deep inland rivers that native English vessels considered too treacherous or too frozen for passage. This logistical nightmare was the first true terror. They weren't just raiding, they were establishing forward operating bases, small temporary enclaves where they could beach their ships, repair their sails, and warm their bodies using the stolen goods and the still smoldering remains of the villages they had just sacked. The smoke from these unseen camps, dark plumes against the low, heavy winter sky, became the new, horrifying weather pattern of the coast. Every lord, every alderman, every terrified priest knew that the invaders were near, but pinning them down was like trying to grasp the sea mist. They struck with the calculated precision of a snake, targeting the soft underbelly of the kingdom, the isolated centers of accumulated wealth and spiritual power. Lindisfarne had been a warning shot years before, a tragic anomaly. Now, the full, crushing weight of organized greed and pagan fury descended upon the rich monasteries of Jarrow, Tynemouth, and later, the vast estates stretching into East Anglia. These places were the libraries, the treasuries, and the hospitals of the age, and their destruction was not just economic, it was cultural annihilation. The Vikings understood the power of psychological warfare long before the term was invented. They didn't just steal the golden chalices. They melted them down in the hallowed naves of the churches, treating the sacred spaces with a deliberate, mocking contempt designed to prove the impotence of the Christian God. Imagine the scene, the frantic ringing of the alarm bells, muffled by falling snow, followed by the terrifying, rhythmic thudding of iron striking wood. The sound of the great two-handed Danish axes, the Dane axe, was a sound that signaled instant and certain death, capable of splitting a shield, an arm, and the torso beneath in a single brutal swing. These were not the ill-equipped bandits of the past. These were professional warriors, often clad in ring mail, carrying round shields painted with terrifying symbols, their faces hidden by heavy iron helms. Their ferocity was legendary, fueled by a relentless pursuit of hlutr and vig, killing or battle. King Ethelred of Northumbria found his realm instantly dissolving into localized panic. The established system of the fyrd, the citizen militia summoned by local lords, was too slow, too disorganized, and too spatially limited to counter an enemy who could vanish and reappear 30 miles down the coast overnight.
When the fyrd finally arrived, exhausted and freezing, they often found only smoking ruins, pools of congealed blood, and the ghostly silence that follows mass slaughter. The great military challenge wasn't fighting the Vikings, it was finding them before they had already sailed away, leaving behind a trail of irreversible devastation. The Anglo-Saxon defense was always reacting. The Norse attack was always initiating. They used the element of surprise not once, but repeatedly, exploiting the deep political fragmentation of the English kingdoms. Why unite to fight the invaders when you might need those few precious soldiers to defend your own small stretch of coastline? This internal division was Viking gold. As the raids escalated, the psychological strain began to manifest in terrifying new forms. Rumors spread like wildfire through the freezing hamlets, tales of monstrous men who ate human flesh, of warriors who fought without fear or armor, the infamous berserkers.
These were the elite shock troops of the Norse jarls, men who would enter battle in a profound, drug-induced trance, roaring like animals, immune or seemingly immune to pain and fatigue. The sight of a half-naked giant draped in a bearskin, ignoring 3 spear thrusts to smash through a shield wall with supernatural strength, was enough to turn the tide of any engagement through sheer, debilitating terror alone. The winter of the axe was not just a season of cold. It was the season when the very fabric of reality twisted, when the civilized world discovered that the ancient, primal chaos it thought it had defeated was sailing back across the black waters, ready to reclaim everything. And this was only the beginning. The Northmen hadn't come for a visit. They had come to stay, to conquer, and to carve out a new destiny in the icy, terrified lands of England. The cold reality that settled over the kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria was thicker and sharper than any winter frost. The Northmen, these demons of the sea, were not simply gathering loot to sail home with the spring tides. They were digging in, driving stakes into the sacred soil of Albion, proclaiming a new, brutal ownership. The kings, men raised on pious hymns and the measured justice of the Witan, were utterly unprepared for this paradigm shift. They had planned defense against raiders. They had no playbook for conquerors who saw their ancient lineage as nothing more than firewood for a victory pyre. Every single breath of wind carried the metallic scent of foreign iron and the guttural, alien tongue of the Norsemen, a language that sounded like stones grinding together in the throat of a giant, mocking the English prayers. The psychological war had begun, waged not with armies, but with silence and the systematic destruction of all hope. The most effective weapon the Vikings wielded was not the long axe, but calculated sacrilege, the intentional destruction of the sacred. Monasteries, the very bedrock of English society, were not just plundered for gold and illuminated manuscripts. They were desecrated, intentionally polluted, their relics scattered to prove the utter impotence of the English God. Think of Lindisfarne, the holy island, now a ghost of ash and broken crosses, a monument to the failure of divine Christian protection. This wasn't merely theft or violence. It was a statement broadcast across the terrified continent. Your gods are weak. Our gods, the terrifying, bloody pantheon of the North, hunger and devour. The priests fled, their vestments torn, their moral and political power evaporating like mist in the face of absolute, merciless violence. And where the church retreated, the Viking law, the lagu, began its slow, inexorable creep, replacing centuries of Saxon tradition with the blunt, swift, and completely unforgiving judgment of the axe. While the foot soldiers enforced the daily chaos and terror, the true architects of this ongoing nightmare were the jarls, the terrifying chieftains whose names were whispered like curses in the longhouse shadows. They were not mere pirates seeking quick riches. They were dynastic psychopaths, driven by a primal, insatiable need for permanent land and eternal glory. Imagine men like Uba, a name that soon became synonymous with brutal efficiency, a leader who seemed to enjoy the terror he inflicted, or Halfdan, whose gaze was said to chill a man to the bone faster than the deepest winter blizzard. These were the generals who reorganized chaos into a terrifyingly effective military machine, establishing fortified camps, the burrs of the invaders, deep inland where the English had thought themselves safe. These camps were strategically placed, often utilizing the ruins of old Roman fortifications, turning ancient defenses against their current inhabitants in a final, ironic twist of fate. They were dark fortresses bristling with spears, supply lines managed with shocking and professional precision, ready to strike at the heart of any localized resistance. The first agonizing act of permanent recognition the Anglo-Saxons had to swallow was the forced payment of the Danegeld, the Dane gold. This was not a bribe meant to make them leave. It was rent, an annual fee for the right to simply breathe on their own ancestral soil. Kings like Ethelred of Wessex and the doomed rulers of Mercia found themselves trapped in a horrifying calculus. Pay the enormous tribute, deplete the national treasury, but buy a few months of tenuous, nerve-wracking peace, or fight and face the absolute, guaranteed annihilation of their remaining scattered forces. Most chose the former, unknowingly funding their own eventual and inevitable destruction. This steady flow of silver was the lifeblood of the occupation. It financed the construction of new longships, armed the unending stream of Norse reinforcements, and cemented the Viking position as the dominant economic and military power in the land.
The English were now vassals in their own homeland, harvesting their fields and tending their livestock only to feed the endless hunger of their conquerors. They were tenants on a lease that could be terminated at the whim of a drunken jarl, signed in the blood of their neighbors. And the tragedy was compounded, magnified tenfold, by the endemic, paralyzing disunity among the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Instead of presenting a unified, impenetrable shield against the Norse axe, they continued their petty generational rivalries, stabbing each other in the back, while the real enemy stood laughing outside the collapsing gates.
Northumbria, always fractious and prone to infighting, descended into bitter civil war. Two rival claimants fighting viciously for a throne that was already functionally owned by a Viking jarl who watched the bloody spectacle with bored amusement. Mercia was paralyzed, constantly bargaining for short-term survival, sacrificing smaller territories and smaller lords to desperately try and save the capital, only delaying the final verdict.
Wessex, the kingdom that would eventually become the crucible of true resistance, was still finding its feet under the shadow of the terror, often fighting alone, watching the slow, agonizing demise of its neighbors with a terror that whispered an unavoidable truth. You are next. The long winter nights, once a time for communal feasting and the retelling of heroic sagas, became a perpetual, exhausting vigil. Every shadow cast by the flickering oil lamp was a potential assassin. Every unusual sound, the scrape of a longship being dragged ashore on a moonless beach. Sleep was a luxury only the dead could afford now.
The scent of wood smoke, once comforting, mingled nauseatingly with the stench of Viking slaughter and unwashed bodies, a constant, sickening reminder that the world had irreversibly changed forever. They were living under a brutal, ticking clockwork of Norse control, where the rules were dictated entirely by the swing of a foreign blade and the terrifying whims of a heathen god who demanded human sacrifice. The coming spring would not bring relief or warmth. It would bring massive reinforcements. The sea was merely a high-speed highway now for Viking armies, and the conquest was entering its terrifying, systematic phase 2, the permanent, bloody carving up of England into a new empire. The nightmare had just gotten bigger, bolder, and far, far more deadly than anyone could have possibly imagined.
The nightmare had just gotten bigger, bolder, and far, far more deadly than anyone could have possibly imagined. The early 9th century terror, those lightning strikes against isolated monasteries, was merely the reconnaissance mission. What arrived next was the true apocalypse, the logistical impossibility made brutally real. The great heathen army, the Mitchell Here, a tidal wave of blood and iron that didn't come to steal treasure, but to steal the very ground beneath the English king's feet. This was not raiding. This was regime change, orchestrated by the devil himself. The scope of this invasion force shattered every preconceived notion of warfare in the Dark Ages. Chroniclers, weeping ink onto their fragile parchment,
struggled to convey the sheer magnitude. Not just hundreds, but thousands of warriors, their longships clogging the estuaries like metallic insects ready to sting the heart out of the island. These weren't seasonal mercenaries. This was a unified, professional military machine, led by names that would soon become whispered curses in every English hovel. Men like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ube. Ivar, a figure shrouded in myth and terror, was the strategic mastermind, possessing a chilling intellect that saw the political fault lines of England clearer than the native kings themselves. He understood that the Heptarchy, the 7 competing kingdoms, was not a united nation, but a series of squabbling siblings ripe for the picking. His target selection was surgical, designed to maximize chaos and minimize coordinated resistance. And the target in 866 CE? Northumbria, the ancient kingdom of scholars and saints, currently embroiled in a fratricidal civil war, provided the perfect entry point. While the Northumbrian nobility were tearing each other apart over who deserved the crown, King Ella or King Osbert, the Viking army quietly, efficiently, and with terrifying precision captured Eoforwick, the mighty city of York. They struck during the Feast of Easter, a deliberate, psychological blow against the very core of Christian belief, turning a day of solemn celebration into a spectacle of horror. Imagine the scene. 2 rival Anglo-Saxon armies, momentarily shocked into recognizing the existential threat, finally united outside their own capital. It was a unity born of desperation, not strength. Their charge against the Viking defenses, while brave, was utterly futile. They faced not just shields and axes, but the cold, calculating tactical genius of Ivar, who knew exactly how to draw them into a killing field. The ensuing slaughter was a massacre of historic proportions. King Aella was reportedly captured and subjected to the ritual known as the Blood Eagle, a barbaric execution so gruesome that medieval scribes could barely bring themselves to describe the tearing of ribs from the spine to resemble wings. This act was more than mere vengeance. It was a declaration. It screamed across the shattered fields that the old rules of war, the rules of chivalry and ransom, were gone. They had entered a new, savage covenant. With Northumbria decapitated and its capital firmly under Viking control, the army settled in for the first true, sustained occupation. This wasn't the winter retreat they were used to. This was the establishment of a forward operating base, a permanent foothold from which the rest of the island could be systematically dismantled. The Norse didn't just occupy York. They began fortifying it, transforming the Roman ruins into a formidable stronghold that would become the beating heart of their nascent kingdom, Jorvik. The shift in strategy was profound. The Vikings began to utilize the captured infrastructure, forcing the local peasantry to support the invaders, turning English resources against English resistance. This economic warfare choked the remaining independent kingdoms. Mercia, sensing the impending doom, tried to buy peace, offering the invaders a tribute, the infamous Danegeld, gold, for temporary respite. This payment was perhaps the single greatest strategic error of the entire century. Paying the Danegeld was like feeding a starving wolf and expecting it to leave your flock alone. It didn't solve the problem. It merely funded the next phase of the invasion, confirming to the Vikings that the English kings were weak, fearful, and most importantly, rich. It provided the necessary capital for the army to consolidate its gains and plan its next move, giving them the leisure to winter over and prepare their next offensive without the pressures of immediate campaigning. King Burgred of Mercia believed he had purchased safety, but he had merely purchased a few years of humiliating servitude. The Vikings used Mercia's territory as a highway, maneuvering their forces southward and westward, testing the defenses of the other major powers. They weren't just following the roads, they were following the rivers, their lone ships acting as rapid, mobile fortresses, allowing them to strike deep inland, far from the coastal defenses that the English had foolishly prioritized. The psychological impact on the common folk was cataclysmic. Their kings were either dead, mutilated, or paying protection money to the very demons they prayed daily to be delivered from. Churches were ransacked not just for treasure, but often burned to the ground, deliberately erasing the symbols of the Christian God, who seemed to have abandoned his flock entirely. Monks, the keepers of literacy and history, fled in terror, carrying fragmented texts, desperately trying to preserve what little civilization remained. This was the terrifying reality of permanent Norse rule beginning to take root. Every harvest became a forced contribution to the invaders. Every winter night brought the fear that the longships would arrive on the fog-shrouded rivers, bringing fresh contingents of warriors, ready to settle the land with their axes and their new gods. The English world was shrinking, suffocating under the heavy, cold grip of the Northmen. The remaining kingdoms watched Northumbria and Mercia fall apart, yet still struggled to coordinate a defense. Pride, ancient rivalries, and petty jealousy proved stronger than the instinct for survival. Only one man, in the far south of Wessex, was beginning to observe, calculate, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. A man whose name would one day define the very survival of England. But for now, he was just another prince, watching his world burn. The stage was set for the final, bloody showdown. The Vikings had solidified their position in the North and Midlands. The rest of England was now surrounded, isolated, and waiting for the final, thunderous blow. The age of the 4 horsemen had arrived, and the greatest terror was that they weren't planning on leaving. The sun did not rise over England in the winter of 870 CE. It merely acknowledged the existence of the perpetual gloom. The cold was a physical, crushing weight, but it was the silence of the occupied villages that truly froze the heart of the Christian world. Every flickering hearth flame was a stolen comfort. The terror had transitioned from the sudden, shrieking raid to the grinding, soul-destroying reality of sustained occupation, a relentless pressure that squeezed the very breath from the landscape. The people were not just suffering, they were being systematically consumed. This new, terrifying entity, the Mysel Hare, The great army did not abide by the rules of seasons or the logic of historical warfare. Previous raiders had retreated when the supply lines froze. These giants anchored themselves, digging into the heart of the land like malignant roots. They had perfected the art of extraction, turning every conquered field, every hidden storehouse, and every terrified community into a functioning logistical base for their endless war machine. They didn't need ships for resupply. They simply bled the English dry. The Northumbrian kingdom had already dissolved into a puppet state, ruled by puppet Norse kings, installed by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Halfdan and Ivar the Boneless, names that echoed with the sound of grinding bones. And now the shadow fell over Mercia, once the pride of the Heptarchy, a kingdom that had dared to rival the might of Charlemagne. King Burgred was not a ruler. He was a hostage in his own palace, his every decision dictated by the glint of a Norse axe held inches from his throat. His attempts at resistance were tragic footnotes in the saga of the great army. He tried to buy them off, offering the infamous Danegeld, a tribute of such colossal wealth that it should have bankrupted the entire kingdom. It was a transaction of utter despair, golden offerings for the promise of peace, which was nothing more than a temporary ceasefire before the demands inevitably escalated, always higher, always bloodier. The Norse accepted the gold, melting down the treasures of ancient saints and kings, and then they simply moved their encampment further south, closer to the last great prize, Wessex.
Mercia had learned the terrible lesson: you cannot bribe a force of nature. You cannot negotiate with a storm that intends not only to flood the valley, but to settle there permanently, rebuilding the houses in its own terrible image.
The psychological warfare was perhaps more effective than the iron weaponry. The Vikings demanded hospitum, total lodging, seizing the halls of the aristocracy and forcing the local population to feed and house the very warriors who had murdered their priests and burned their churches. Imagine the horror, sharing your bread, your fire, your last moments of desperate warmth with the men whose breath smelled of pagan sacrifice and conquest. Every meal became a sacrament of humiliation, a forced communion with the devil himself. Failure to comply meant not instant death, but a slow, calculated destruction of the community, starting with the seizure of livestock and ending with the taking of children as collateral, ensuring absolute, paralyzing compliance. This was how the Dana Law was born, not in a single decisive battle, but in the million small surrenders forced upon a weary, starving population who simply ran out of the will to resist the inevitable tide. While Mercia crumbled, Wessex stood alone, an isolated island in a sea of encroaching darkness. Their defenses were rapidly becoming the only barrier between the great heathen army and the total obliteration of the Christian project in Britain. The army,
now operating with the precision of a massive, unified military machine, had wintered deep within conquered territory, consolidating power rather than fleeing the cold. In the spring of 871 CE, the Norse shifted their focus entirely toward Wessex, their massive columns streaming out of Mercia and establishing a fortified camp at Reading.
This was not a quick raid. This was the establishment of a forward operating base, designed to withstand any assault the fragmented Anglo-Saxons could muster. It was a declaration of permanent residence.
The Wessex court, led by King Ethelred and his younger, intensely capable brother, Alfred, watched the approaching storm with a mixture of dread and feverish planning. They knew that if Reading fell, the entire kingdom was next.
The reports flooding in were apocalyptic. The speed of the Norse movements, their uncanny ability to strike at weak points, and the sheer number of warriors seemed to defy all known military doctrine. They were not just an army. They were a moving fortress, a civilization on the march, driven by an almost supernatural hunger for land and glory. The people of Wessex, still clinging desperately to the faith that had defined their ancestors, began to question the very fabric of their world. Where was God in this unfolding nightmare? Why were the prayers of the faithful answered only by the laughter of the heathen? The first major confrontation arrived with brutal suddenness at the Battle of Reading. Wessex forces, desperately trying to dislodge the invaders from their new fortress, met only with catastrophic failure and a punishing counterattack. It was a bloody confirmation that the Viking age of scattered raiders was over. These were professional soldiers, masters of strategy and terrifying discipline, commanded by men who saw the crown of Wessex as the ultimate prize. The English suffered a devastating loss, retreating in disarray, leaving the bodies of their nobles and the shattered remains of their shield wall on the frozen ground. The great army had successfully breached the perimeter. The last viable defense of Christian England was now reduced to scrambling for its life, fighting on its own doorstep. The subsequent battle, the crucial, legendary stand at Ashtown, was already being written in the stars. The stage was set for the final, desperate act of the Anglo-Saxon resistance, a conflict that would either save the island or plunge it forever into the long shadow of the Norse gods. The winter had broken, and the land was ready to drink the blood of kings. The thaw did not bring relief. It brought the reckoning. When the frozen ground finally softened, it wasn't the sweet promise of planting that greeted the terrified English farmers, but the drumbeat of iron on shields, echoing across the newly freed mudflats. The Norsemen, who had endured the impossible cold, now shed their heavy furs and moved with the lean, predatory efficiency of wolves sensing a wounded herd. They were no longer raiders looking for quick loot. They were an occupying force, meticulously drawing lines on a map that spelled the end of the English kingdoms. Their greatest weapon, beyond the terrifying skill of their berserkers, was the mastery
of water. They didn't just sail the sea. They claimed the rivers, turning the arteries of England, the Thames, the Trent, the Great Ouse, into Norse highways of destruction. These rivers, once the safe routes of trade and pilgrimage, now delivered death directly to the heartlands, bypassing hastily erected defensive walls and striking deep into Mercian territory, where defense was weak and scattered. The longships, shallow-drafted and impossibly swift, could appear from the morning mist like spectral dragons, disgorging hundreds of hardened warriors before the alarm bells even had a chance to ring. They moved with a terrifying speed that defied the traditional slowness of medieval armies, leveraging the network of waterways to outmaneuver the lumbering Anglo-Saxon defense forces.
The psychological assault was precise and designed to shatter the very foundation of belief. The Vikings understood that to conquer England, they must first kill its god. Monasteries and cathedrals were targeted not just for their immense wealth, the stored gold and silver that funded the war effort, but because they represented the spiritual and administrative backbone of the entire Saxon society. Lindisfarne was merely the horrific prelude. Now every stone abbey, every silent scriptorium, every center of learning and prayer became a funeral pyre, the smoke carrying the stench of burning parchment and consecrated wood up to a seemingly disinterested heaven, confirming the darkest fears of the populace. God had truly abandoned them. In Wessex, King Ethelred, a man barely into his prime, yet carrying the crushing weight of a dying age, watched the reports flood in, each message dripping with terror and defeat, detailing the horrifying efficiency of the northern advance. He knew the terrible truth. The fragmented kingdoms of the Heptarchy, constantly bickering over ancient land boundaries and petty feuds, were utterly unprepared for this coordinated, unified catastrophe engineered by the sons of Ragnar. He was frantically trying to forge a single, unbreakable shield from brittle, jealous iron, knowing that failure meant eternal servitude to the Norse gods, the endless ringing of the axe, and the total erasure of his family's legacy. The call went out across the land, a desperate, echoing summons to the feared, the militia of freemen obligated by ancient law to serve their king in times of invasion. These were not professional soldiers hardened by years of war, but farmers, blacksmiths, and simple landholders, trading their scythes for hastily sharpened spears, and their agricultural surety for desperate, immediate hope. They were brave, yes, fueled by faith and fury for their homes, but they utterly lacked the discipline, the terrifying, mechanized shield wall mastery, and the sheer bloodlust of the Norse veterans, who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of sudden, brutal, close-quarters death. The contrast on the battlefield was a clash between two fundamentally different worlds, a technical and tactical mismatch that usually ended in a Saxon bloodbath. The English defense relied heavily on the heavy, yet cumbersome chainmail of their professional thanes and the dense, linear formation of their shield walls, designed for grueling battles of attrition where ground was slowly traded for blood. But the Vikings favored blistering speed, terrifying flanking maneuvers, and the devastating power of the Dane axe, a specialized weapon that could cleave a man and his wooden shield in half with a single sweeping blow, ignoring the standard Saxon defenses. The English fought desperately to defend their homes and their Christian future. The Norse fought to earn Valhalla, a motivation far more deadly, making them indifferent to earthly survival. The Norse strategy quickly solidified into systematic destruction. Immobilize the local rulers by taking their central fortifications and denying them a base of operations. A targeted campaign began against the key royal burghs, turning once proud fortified towns into desperate, claustrophobic death traps, surrounded by fields of silent, watchful enemies. Food and potable water immediately became the most precious commodity, and the very act of sending a single scout beyond the walls meant facing swift, brutal execution by patrolling Norse skirmishers who were masters of the silent woodland ambush, leaving only headless corpses as warnings. And worse than the external enemy was the corrosive enemy within the Saxon heart, paralyzing fear that metastasized into treachery. In some critical areas, local reeves and desperate minor nobles, seeking only to save their own immediate families and lands from the torch, offered the invaders tribute, the infamous Danegeld, a temporary, shameful bribe paid in silver and gold. Every single coin paid only confirmed the Norsemen's conviction that the English were weak, disorganized, and ripe for permanent plundering and prolonged occupation. Every gold coin paid was a future chain forged around the neck of England, guaranteeing that the Vikings would return, stronger, more arrogant, and infinitely more demanding. The spring campaign exploded into open warfare across the Midlands, forcing Ethelred to move his main forces north to try and stem the bleeding. The land was not merely conquered, it was systematically dissected, carved up by axe and sword into territories defined by unchecked terror and brutal efficiency. The time for diplomacy and hopeful retreat had utterly vanished with the winter snows. Only steel remained to decide the fate of 1,000 years of history and the future of Christianity on the island. Ethelred knew he had to meet the storm head-on, in a decisive, terrifying engagement, or watch his kingdom dissolve into the bloody mud forever. The first great pitched battle of the campaign was now inevitable, a terrifying engagement that would either break the Norse backbone or completely shatter the last vestiges of Christianity in the north. The long night of Norse rule was descending, and the screams of the dying were the only illumination left for England. The English had desperately clung to the ancient superstition that the Norse fury, tied irrevocably to the sea and the fair weather of the raiding season, would surely vanish when the bitter, freezing breath of the North Sea winter swept inland. They believed the cold, the snow, and the impenetrable mud would be their God-given shield, forcing the heathen horde back to their longships and across the merciless ocean to their frigid homeland. This hope was the last fragile illusion that separated sanity from absolute terror, and it was violently shattered the moment the first blizzard howled across the frozen estuaries. The Norse did not retreat. They simply transformed,
showing the stunned Saxons that their invasion was not a seasonal affliction, but a fundamental, geological shift in the balance of power. The ice did not halt the northern demons. It became their road, a hardened highway upon which they moved with a terrifying speed previously unimaginable. They dragged their massive, iconic longships not back to the sea, but far inland, turning them over and using them as grotesque, impervious shelters, dominating the ruined river towns like monstrous, upturned beasts of burden. This was the chilling, irrefutable proof. This was not a raid. It was a permanent, terrifying declaration of occupation, a war waged against the very concept of Anglo-Saxon perpetuity. Every frozen breath exhaled by a Saxon farmer was a silent, desperate prayer that went unanswered by a heaven that seemed to have abandoned them entirely to the chilling, indifferent mercies of Odin. The kings of the fragmented English lands, obsessed with their petty feudal rivalries, still refused to comprehend the magnitude of the horror that had rooted itself in their soil. Mercia, Northumbria, and the rising power of Wessex, instead of uniting their shields against the Crimson Tide, squabbled over the ghost of supremacy, a fatal, tragic flaw that the Norse understood with predatory instinct. The Viking strategists, watching the internal strife from their fortified winter camps, observed the native rulers like patient, ravenous wolves, watching lambs argue over the choicest patch of dying grass. The Norse played the long game, using the deep, unforgiving English countryside not as a barrier, but as a vast, rich hunting ground, stretching their terror thin enough to cover every mile of the doomed land. Their true secret weapon, more potent than the feared Dane axe, was their horrifying mobility. They commandeered the thousands of horses left abandoned or captured from ravaged English farms, transforming their seafaring warriors, feared for their shield walls, into a terrifying horseback riding army that could strike 50 miles inland overnight, shattering the ancient, complacent assumptions of coastal and river defense. They moved faster than rumor, appearing like vengeful phantoms summoned by the deepest night terrors, leaving no time for the scattered local fyrds to muster any organized response. Before a local force could even gather its pitiful collection of rusty spears, the warband was often already gone, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of a village and the gruesome ritualistic sacrifice of the fallen, a warning carved in blood. The monasteries, once the inviolable beacons of civilization, learning, and immense wealth, were now universally hollowed-out monuments to futility and a testament to God's silence. The common folk witnessed the appalling sight of their most sacred servants, the monks, forced to watch the destruction of their holy relics, their priceless illuminated manuscripts used as kindling for the Viking campfires. This was a profound, soul-crushing blow to the very foundation of Saxon faith. If God could not protect his most sacred places and his most devout servants, what hope remained for the peasant huddled in his wattle and daub hut, praying for a dawn that seemed determined never to arrive? The suffocating silence that followed a raid
was often infinitely more terrifying than the battle itself, a vacuum where the structures of law, religion, and communal order had once stood, now filled only by the cold, indifferent wind and the ever-present shadow of the raven banner. In the conquered lands of the North and East Anglia, the Norse were not merely squatting, they were building, consolidating their gains with ruthless efficiency. They established massive, defensive burhs of their own, often utilizing the ruins of ancient Roman forts or brutally commandeering and reinforcing Saxon earthworks with massive palisades of rough-hewn timber. These strongholds, rapidly erected and formidably defended, like the ominous encampment at Repton or the seized Roman city of York, became the pulsating black hearts of their new dominion. They were permanent bases from which the terror could be sustained year after year, refusing to melt away with the anticipated spring thaw, signaling the birth of what would become known as the Danelaw. The English had initially been fighting ghosts and transient raiders. Now they faced solid, terrifying fortresses and a disciplined, entrenched army. Against this insurmountable, encroaching darkness, flickering candles of resistance were desperately lit, primarily in the south, where the beleaguered House of Wessex struggled for survival. The surviving English military leaders, driven by necessity and the brutal lessons of repeated massacres, began to learn the unforgiving, necessary language of guerrilla warfare. They quickly realized that any attempt at a pitched, open-field battle was suicide. The sheer, overwhelming ferocity and the disciplined shield wall of the Norse warriors were unmatched in direct confrontation. Survival demanded adaptation, forcing the Saxons to hide deep within the inaccessible marshlands, striking savagely at Viking foraging and supply lines, and learning to mimic the lethal hit-and-run tactics that the invaders themselves had perfected into an art form. Yet, even these small, desperate victories were paid for in rivers of blood. The Vikings, when thwarted or embarrassed, did not merely retreat. They retaliated with a savage, focused brutality upon the nearest civilian settlement, ensuring that the cost of organized resistance was always perceived as infinitely higher than any potential reward. The choice presented to the common folk was simple, agonizing, and paralyzing. Fight and watch your entire village burn, your family enslaved, or kneel immediately and perhaps be spared to till the land for your new, terrifying masters. The spring of the year brought no relief, only the grim sight of new sails appearing on the horizon, swelling the ranks of the already entrenched great heathen army. This was the true, unending terror, the relentless pressure, the knowledge that the world they had known was gone forever, and that the nightmare was merely beginning. England was transforming, becoming terra nova for the Norse gods, consecrated by the sacrifices of fallen Christian priests and the silent despair of the conquered. The long night of Norse rule had not ended. It was merely settling in, comfortable,
and ready to consume another 100 years of Anglo-Saxon history, setting the stage for the Great Reckoning where kings would fall like dominoes. The dominoes were already tipping, but the first to fall were not the great stone walls of the monasteries, but the fragile alliances forged in the weak warmth of Christian brotherhood. The kings of Mercia and Wessex, blinded by centuries of petty squabbling, failed to grasp the scale of the horror gathering just across the icy water, refusing to believe that a threat could be greater than their own lust for adjacent farmland. This fatal myopia, this catastrophic political deafness, was the true initial victory of the Norsemen, a victory won not with the axe, but with the cold, calculated silence of preparation. While the Anglo-Saxons debated the price of sheep and the lineage of minor bishops, the Jarls of the North Sea were performing an unprecedented act of unification. These were not the isolated pirate gangs of Lindisfarne. This was the deliberate, strategic assembly of the Great Host, a creeping, oceanic malignancy designed to stop merely raiding and start ruling. They didn't just want silver anymore. They wanted the very soil beneath the English farmers' feet, the stone of their halls, and the souls of their priests. The whisper campaign that began spreading from court to court was more deadly than any battle cry. The Vikings were demanding an official payment to leave, a ransom so vast it defied calculation. And thus, born from sheer stomach-churning terror and desperation, came the concept that would cripple England for a century: the Danegeld. Imagine the psychological breaking point of the king, sworn to protect his people by the grace of God, agreeing to pay the blood price, a ransom so staggering it emptied the royal treasuries and mortgaged the future harvests of every single peasant. It was a poison payment, a fleeting, temporary ceasefire purchased at the cost of national suicide. This was not a treaty of peace. It was a subscription to destruction, a self-imposed financial apocalypse. Every ounce of silver handed over to the Viking warlords was immediately melted down, reforged into the very swords and axes that would, inevitably, be aimed back at the hands that paid the tribute. The English were literally funding their own demise, pouring unimaginable wealth into the bottomless, terrifying war chest of the invaders, empowering the very force they sought to repel. The collection of the Danegeld quickly became an internal terror, almost as destructive as the raids themselves. Tax collectors, armed with the royal seal and shivering with cold and dread, swept across the shires, demanding impossible quantities of silver from monasteries already stripped bare, and from villages where starvation was already a familiar guest. The desperation forced the unthinkable. Churches were compelled to melt down sacred relics, croziers, chalices, and reliquaries, transforming the symbols of their faith into the currency of their bondage. The psychological damage inflicted upon the populace was irreparable. The people lost faith not just in their Christian God, who seemed to have abandoned them to the pagan terror, but also in their kings, who appeared weak and desperate,
relying on cash rather than courage to defend their God-given land. The pact with the devil had been signed, and the ink was the metallic sheen of looted silver, staining the legacy of every ruler who agreed to the vile exchange. But the Norse strategy was evolving faster than the English could print their futile currency, proving they were brilliant, terrifyingly adaptive tacticians, not just chaotic pirates. They realized that the English winter, which they had previously treated as a season to avoid, could be turned into their greatest ally, a frozen fortress protecting them from predictable Anglo-Saxon retaliation. Suddenly, the raids didn't end with the first hard frost and the shortened days. Instead, the Vikings began digging in, establishing winter camps, massive, heavily fortified, often palisaded bases deep within enemy territory, usually strategically placed near navigable rivers to ensure rapid mobility when the ice thawed. These camps were the dagger plunged into the heart of the kingdom. Sites like Repton and Torksey were not temporary shelters. They were beachheads for sustained conquest, turning previously safe English heartlands into perpetual zones of danger. They housed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of disciplined warriors, along with their horses and supplies, ensuring that the invading force could maintain pressure year-round. The psychological pressure became overwhelming. The enemy was no longer a phantom appearing on the tide for a few months of summer plunder. The enemy was sleeping just down the river, waiting for spring, fully funded by the very gold they had extorted. The line between occupied and free territory began to blur irrevocably, dissolving the stability of the entire society. The winter of the Danegeld was the final, fatal moment when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could have united and stood whole against the gathering storm. Instead, they scattered, each king hoarding his meager resources and praying with futile fervor that the dragon of the Northmen would choose to eat his neighbor first. This era of self-interest and financial surrender sealed their fate, ensuring that when the full, consolidated weight of the great army finally arrived to claim England, it would not meet a unified front, but a collection of terrified, bankrupt, and mutually suspicious remnants of kingdoms. The stage was set for the impossible war, the existential fight for the very soul of England, which would ultimately fall upon the shoulders of a single, desperate man, known to history as Alfred. But that struggle was still years away, and the darkness had to deepen first, reaching down into the very foundations of the realm.